Chapter 30. Bonus Chapter, New Transformation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Blood Night, Ignition, Warning, the system has detected changes to the host's body, the bloodline has evolved, and the skill is not applicable anymore, initiating the evolution of the skill. Ding! Blood Night, Ignition, has evolved and 2 transformations have been created. Blood Lord, Awakening, Lord of the Dark, Awakening. The following transformations each have their own advantages and disadvantages. The effects are the following. Blood Lord, Awakening, the host taps into his class and becomes a true Lord of Blood for a short period of time. During this state, the ability to control blood is empowered multifold while the host stats receive a moderate increase. The host will be unable to use any weapons or attacks that do use blood. Lord of the Dark, Awakening, the host taps deep into his bloodline and turns into a true vampire lord for a short period of time. The host's ability to control darkness will receive a great boost while the stats of the host will be increased multifold as well. If the host still does not have the ability to control darkness, then the overall stats will increase even more while the ability to control the dark will be partially available to the host. The ability to manipulate blood will, however, be locked during the transformation. Does the host wish to activate one of the 2 skills right now? 2 skills, each one a transformation. Lyle stared at the 2 incredible skills he had acquired. He never thought that the skill he didn't use because he had no idea if it would even work would give birth to such 2 powerful ones. He quickly skimmed through the notifications before choosing the second one. The Blood Lord transformation was definitely good, but his ability to control blood was abysmally weak right now, and no amount of boosting would make it strong enough to allow him to contend against the bear that was gaining on him. The second one not only gave him more boost when it came to his stats but also unlocked the ability to control darkness, albeit partly. As Lyle activated the transformation, a change occurred. His aura flared up before an incredibly powerful sense of suppression hit the bear. It wasn't only the bear, most of the forest was able to feel the aura that was coming from Lyle at this moment, as he wasn't trying to hide it at all. On the contrary, he was using everything he had in order to make the aura more powerful. His killing intent exploded, the bloodlust he had gained flared up and his bloodline was fully activated. A black suit appeared on Lyle as his hair turned pitch black, as did his eyes. They looked more like 2 small black holes than eyes at this point. He grew a bit taller and his skin became white. The calluses he had on his hands suddenly disappeared while his nails grew a bit longer. The suit that was on him was pitch black, with some silver on it. There was a silver formal shirt underneath the suit jacket, and the pants he now had on him were pitch black as well, as were the shoes. He looked like he came straight out of an average vampire movie where all the vampires acted like aristocracy and loved to dress up. His long hair swayed in the wind as he stared at the bear with hostility. The bear stopped, its eyes constricted as he stared at Lyle. It could feel the incredible power coming from the person in front of it, and fear slowly crept up on it as it didn't know whether it should flee or simply lie down and prepare for death. Lyle stared at the monster before snapping his fingers. A curtain of darkness appeared in front of him, blocking the sight of the bear completely. As soon as Lyle did that, he quickly turned around and ran with all of his might. His speed was now almost triple what it was before, but he was still not as fast as the bear, and if the latter started running after him, he would be caught. The show of force that Lyle previously did was simply to trick the bear into thinking that Lyle was now the stronger one and that continuing to pursue him would lead to death. He knew that something like that wouldn't last for long, so he bailed out. The bear stared at the curtain of darkness without even blinking. It wondered what just happened. Why did the weak human suddenly become so powerful, and why did he suddenly put darkness in front of him? The bear curiously looked at the curtain before it slowly started disappearing. In a matter of moments, it was gone and the bear could see everything in front of it. There was nobody there, there was not even a shadow of Lyle that previously stood in front of the bear. The bear stared before sniffing the air. There was no scent, it was completely gone. It stared ahead before slowly turning around and going back to its nest. It had no idea what just happened or why the powerful being spared it, but it wouldn't linger around to find out. When the bear was about half the way to his nest, something else happened. A small creature the size of a human appeared. The only difference between the creature and a human was the small horns it had on its head. The bear roared at the creature before charging at it, only to suddenly stop after the creature appeared on its back. Before the bear could do anything, the creature landed a powerful punch to its back, breaking it. It then appeared in front of the bear before putting a hand to its head and whispering something. It closed its eyes for a couple of seconds before opening them again. As for the bear, it didn't move at all, its heart had stopped and its brain was destroyed. The creature in front of the bear was a demon. Demons could be found in Corleone, but they were rare and extremely powerful. Demons such as this one didn't exist on the planet, however. The demon had used an ability that was common for its race, memory reading. It was only able to see a couple of minutes from the bear's memory. It looked through the memory in reverse. It started with the bear staring at it, whilst ending at the bear staring at Lyle, who had already turned to his vampire lord form. Upon seeing what had happened, the demon opened its eyes wide in shock before hurrying back to the depths of the forest, atop the highest mountain. Lyle was unaware of this, but his transformation had caused such a ruckus that even the people inside the city had felt his aura when he first transformed. The aura would only appear once like this, without any control, and that was when it was first used. Even back when Lyle first used his Blood Knight ignition, it had caused a great scene as his aura flaring up was felt about a kilometer around him. Compared to this, however, it was nothing, as everything in a radius of a couple of miles around Lyle was able to sense it. The powerful monsters of the forest had all lied down on the floor and trembled. The demons that made their home on the mountain stared at the place where Lyle was with great fear, while the commander and the powerful soldiers in the city all stared in shock at the forest, their eyes filled with fear. The aura of a vampire lord was something that only tier 6 creatures could stand up against, and in the whole empire, there were no such powerful beings. The commander trembled slightly upon sensing such a powerful aura before closing his eyes. He had once felt the aura of the man that the empire praised as the god of war, and even he was nothing compared to this. There was no need to panic. If the person whose aura they just felt wanted to kill them, the whole city would be pulverized before anyone could realize what had happened. As for the demons, after the one that had read the bear's memory returned and told them of what had happened, they all panicked. Whatever plans they had would now have to be put to a stop. They quickly put everything they needed before fleeing the mountain and heading in a different direction. This would hurt them a lot, but they would all rather have their plans hindered for some time and not get killed. If they stayed on the mountain and the being who they felt decided to come up, then all of them would die, that much was absolute. Lyle had unknowingly put a stop to the plan the demon had and potentially saved the city of Olswyn and perhaps the whole area from demonic attacks. As for the person that had just put the fear of God into the hearts of all beings nearby, he was at the edge of the forest and was panting heavily as his transformation had ended. Chapter 31. The Vampire Lords Gather. You are listening at novelfull.audio. While Lyle was resting at the edge of the forest, unaware of what his transformation had done to the demon that had just appeared on the planet, the Empire of the Vampires was also going through a commotion when it came to the higher-ups. There were currently 6 vampire lords in the Empire. Each one was a tier 6 being that could make kingdoms and weaker empires shake by themselves. Each one was staring in Lyle's direction at this moment. They had felt it. The appearance of a new vampire lord. The moment that Lyle had activated his transformation, the bloodline inside the other lords reacted and they immediately found out about his existence. They weren't as powerful as the Empress, who was able to sense him the very first day he managed to evolve his bloodline, but his turning into a lord and leaking out his aura was enough to make them know of him. Even Isaac, Lyle's father, had sensed him. As a vampire lord himself, and the one that shared the closest bloodline with Lyle, Isaac had not only sensed his existence but the approximate location of him. Of course, the location he sensed was simply that he was thousands of miles away, and if he was to travel to it, he could find out the region in which Lyle stayed. By region, I mean the area where multiple kingdoms and empires could be found. It was a huge expanse of land that would take weeks if not months for Isaac to comb over. He wasn't going to do it, however, as he already knew about Lyle. The other lords, however, called for a meeting. The lords all gathered and discussed what had just happened. Isaac was the last one to arrive, and upon seeing him, the others all went silent for a moment. Isaac, the executioner. That was his title. Isaac was the one in charge of dealing with traitors and those that had failed the empress. He had even killed a lord by himself in the past and was considered to be the second or third most powerful lord in the empire. Amongst the lords, one wasn't present. The one not present was the oldest and most powerful among them. Even the existence of a new lord would not shake him and make him show up, as he would only appear when there was a dire situation that needed to be resolved, or when the empress called for him. "Lord Isaac, what should we do about the new lord? Did the empress say anything?" one of the lords asked as Isaac sat down on a chair. "Yes, Her Majesty told me not to do anything." "What?" all the lords exclaimed unanimously as they stared at Isaac in shock. The birth of a new lord was not a small matter. Each one was a powerhouse in the world, and they were a valuable resource to the empire and the most respected beings in it. The change the world had gone through was an even bigger reason to find the new lord and bring him to the empire in order to join them. "I don't know the specifics, but Her Majesty has told me that the new lord is a special case and that when the time is right, he will come to us by himself." "Oh, so it's another man, and here I hope to get a new friend with whom I could gossip," a woman said as she glanced at another woman at the table. Amongst the lords, only two were women, and one of them was the one that contested for the place of second strongest with Isaac. "Well, if the empress had said so, then I guess we have nothing to worry about," another lord said as he leaned back on his chair. "Now, do we maybe have something else that needs to be discussed? It's not often that we all gather like this after all," a fourth lord said as the others all glanced at each other before they started talking. The meeting lasted for about an hour. There were many light-hearted conversations, but there were also heated arguments that almost led to fights. Back in the Golden Lion Empire, Lyle had finally rested enough. Transforming into a vampire lord was not as simple as his previous Blood Knight transformation, as it not only gave him more power, but also made him quite weak after it ended. The mana consumption that Lyle had gone through after using the Veil of Darkness and after pouring all of his mana into his legs was very high and had left him empty after he had arrived at the edge of the forest. Lyle moved closer to the city after using the disguise of a killman. Upon reaching the gate, he was surprised to see over 40 soldiers that were being led by a silver knight waiting at the gate. "Shit, did they see through my disguise?" Lyle thought as he calmly walked towards them. He knew that there was no going back. If they had truly managed to see through him, then he would simply show the symbol of the midnight dagger that he had with him. Turning around and trying to escape would be impossible since there was a silver knight present. "Ah, sir, you have returned." The soldier that spoke with Lyle last night was the first person to respond. The other soldiers simply nodded at Lyle as they knew of his identity already. "Yes, there were some issues at the forest," Lyle said as he looked calmly at the soldier who seemed a bit confused. "Issues? I'm sorry sir, but I wouldn't call such a powerful aura just an issue. We were ready to face death after sensing it, and the commander himself told us that it was a monster that was above a titled knight, a tier 5 or above that released that monstrous aura." Lyle was suddenly shocked. They felt it too. "Damn it, I never thought that my transformation would do something like this." "Well, the truth is, that was no monster," Lyle said as he looked at the soldier with a serious expression. It was now the soldier's turn to be shocked. Even the Silver Knight stared at Lyle with surprise. "Sir, you came across it?" "Yes, and it is a he, not it," Lyle said in a serious tone before glancing at the other soldiers. "There is no need to worry. That person had no ill intentions. He had only released his aura after I started interrogation him. If he had any notions of causing chaos or killing people, I wouldn't be alive right now." Gulp. The soldiers all gulped as they imagined the scene of a lone killman trying to interrogate a suspicious individual in the forest, only to be shocked by finding out the person was actually such a powerful being. He said that he was merely passing by and wanted to do a quick check of how much the forest had changed. After that, well, he disappeared, Lyle said before shaking his head. There is no reason to think too much, none of us are capable of meddling in the affairs of such powerful beings. Hell, I can't even remember what he even looked like. The soldiers all nodded after hearing Lyle's words, even the Silver Knight seemed to fully agree with him. Sir is probably exhausted after what happened, please do go in and get some rest. The Silver Knight spoke as Lyle nodded gratefully at him before stepping inside the city and disappearing from their sight. Sir? The soldier at the front asked as he looked at the Silver Knight. No good, I wasn't able to sense anything from him. I did notice residual traces of that powerful aura, but that was probably the residual energy after being exposed to the aura of that powerful being. Anyway, go and inform the commander, it seems everything will be alright. The Silver Knight said as he removed his helmet from his head. Silver hair fell down his forehead and partially blocked his blue eyes as he gazed at the forest in front of him. Yes, sir. The soldier shouted before running to the castle. A killman, plus the appearance of an incredibly powerful being, is my empire fated to fall? The silver-haired man said as he stared in front of him. Master was assassinated, by the help of his son, nonetheless. The vultures around the empire banded together and attacked, barely being pushed backward after the empire had lost a lot of land. Then, when we finally had some time to rest, the entire world changes, monsters start running rampant and nobody knows what will happen next. Will we survive all of this? Is it our destiny to fall down, to crash and burn and be forgotten in the history books? No, I will not let that happen. I will be the one to raise the empire higher than it ever was once I inherit the throne. Said Seed Silver, the third son of the emperor and the only personal student of the old god of war of the empire. Even though he had 2 brothers and 2 sisters that were older than him and were closer to inheriting the throne, he was the one that most of the empire believed would become the ruler in the end. Chapter 32. Bonus Chapter, The Third Prince. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Seed, even though he was a prince, loved adventure and fighting. This was one of the reasons why he used his authority to make the general in charge of this operation place him in the company of soldiers that were going to take over the castle. He wanted to be certain that nothing would be missed and that the evidence against Orsted would be found together with the evidence that would condemn the other nobles. Even the commander had no idea that the third prince was in his company, and contrary to his belief, none of the nobles and higher-ups of the dukedom would get to evade their charges. Seed was going to make certain of that. The old duke was his teacher, the person that taught him everything he knew. He had a very close relationship with him, and even though he tried bonding with Orsted in the past, it was obvious that Orsted disliked him very much. Perhaps it was because he was more talented and thus was able to spend a lot of time with the duke, or maybe it was simply because he was everything that Orsted wished to be. There was a point in time when Orsted was angry at himself. His father was his idol and he wished nothing else but to follow in his footsteps, but his meager talent in both magic and swordsmanship made that impossible. After some time, the hatred that Orsted harbored for himself disappeared as he started hating his father. He was quite a hypocrite. He hated his father because he was so talented and revered by others, but had no qualms about using his identity and wealth to do anything he wished to do. Seed's heart broke after he learned of the old duke's death. He was one of the first to go to the place where the battle took place before going to the castle to express his condolence and pay his respect to his late master and his wife. Orsted looked heartbroken as well, and the two actually spent some time together. They talked and shared stories of the old duke before Seed had to leave. He had already lost his teacher, one of the people he cared about the most in the world. He wasn't going to lose anyone else. The funny thing was that the soldier that Seed commanded didn't realize who he was until he arrived at the commander's office to give out a report. The other soldiers were all staring at Seed in awe and shock as they were able to recognize him. The third son of the emperor was a major figure in the empire and many knew his face. They all quickly kneeled down before Seed told them to get up. My prince, why are you here, since when were you? One of the senior soldiers suddenly stopped talking as Seed lifted his hand. I was here since the beginning, I will explain everything later, I'm going to the castle first. To the castle, why my lord? I am taking over the operation, this has become much bigger than we anticipated, Seed said before his figure turned into a blur as he sped to the castle. The soldier and the commander had just started talking and the soldier was telling him of the knight who looked incredibly similar to the prince before the door opened and Seed came in. My prince. The commander hurriedly stood up before trying to kneel down, only to be stopped by Seed. No need to kneel, we are all alone here, stand up commander, let me hear of what you have found out. The commander simply nodded before the soldier behind them bowed and left the study. The next 30 minutes the commander spent by telling Seed everything he had uncovered from the tens of documents they had taken, and there were still more that he needed to go over. Those bastards. Seed suddenly said as he controlled himself in order not to let his mana flow out. He was in the study of his late teacher, he would never forgive himself if he unintentionally destroyed anything here. They really took their positions for granted, not even bothering to hide their crimes, as if the crown didn't exist, Seed said with a dangerous smile before looking at the commander. You said that you already found evidence on all the perpetrators, commander. Yes sir, the other documents are just more crimes the same people had done, this is already enough to lock them up. The commander said as his hands were clenched into fists. I'd like to see those bastards try and slither their way out now, the prince will never let them go off the hook, no matter who their backers are. The commander thought as a slight smile formed on his face, he knew that the prince was someone that had high moral standing and was not one to let evildoers off lightly. Call them over, all of them, tell them that I am here, Seed said before turning around and walking towards the door. I will be in the main hall. Yes my lord. The commander said as he bowed down. My lord. Yes, commander. What are you going to do? Suddenly an evil and twisted smile appeared on Seed's face whose back was turned to the commander. Some will die, some will spend the rest of their pathetic lives in a cell, while others will serve as my dogs until the end of their days, is that a fine solution in your opinion, commander? Seed asked as the commander gulped from the coldness he felt coming from Seed. It is more than a fine one, my lord. In less than 1 hour, all the nobles, ministers, and other higher-ups of the dukedom had gathered in the main hall. They had heard that the third prince had personally come here and was expecting them. All of them were scared senseless, they knew just what kind of a person the prince was and that he definitely knew what they had done in the dukedom. As all the people in the hall were wondering where the prince was, a door that was to the side of the hall opened as the prince entered. He didn't bother changing and was still wearing his armor while his helmet was being held in his left hand. He calmly walked through the hall before sitting at the second biggest chair that was at the head of the hall. The largest one was the one that the Duke himself had used, Seed didn't want to sit on it simply out of respect for his teacher. The people in the hall suddenly trembled as the temperature inside dropped by a few degrees. Upon looking at the prince, they were scared senseless by the cold and murderous look in his eyes. Good, you are all here. The prince suddenly said as he looked down on them all. May I ask of you, esteemed gentlemen and ladies, why do you all look like you have seen a ghost? Seed asked them as he put his right leg over his left one and leaned back on the chair. He leaned his head sideways and propped it up with his left hand while looking at them all from above. The people were speechless, they knew that the prince had definitely found out about what they were doing and that they wouldn't be let off easily. Even holding on to their titles and land would be an almost impossible task. My prince, may I ask what your esteemed self is doing here? One of the people, the head of one of the most powerful noble houses in the dukedom asked as he slightly bowed to the prince. Why am I here? Well, it is because I found out that the son of my late teacher was assassinated, I arrived now in order to help the soldiers with uncovering what had happened. I see, and may this humble servant ask why you have gathered us all here today? A simple question, the answer is even simpler: I wish for your cooperation, all the manpower you have, all the connections you have. I want you to use them all and find out who it was that killed Orsted. Furthermore, I need a personal favor from you and a couple of others, Orsted said as he suddenly pointed at the man, alongside a couple of others. They were the ones whose crimes, and the crimes of their family members, were the least atrocious when compared to the rest. As for finding out who killed Orsted, it was a futile quest, as the crown itself had shielded the midnight dagger. No matter who tried to investigate the matter, they would get no information at all. The rest of you are dismissed, Seed said as the nobles looked at each other in confusion. They were all ready to be arrested tonight, for their titles to be taken and heads to roll. Instead, the prince only gathered them to ask something so simple from them. All of them were relieved, except for some that were a bit more tactful and experienced. They knew that this matter was far from over and was in fact only starting. Amongst the people in the crowd was one person that glanced back at the prince with an interesting glint in his eyes. The young man simply walked out with the others before his presence disappeared as he climbed the side of the hall, his body hidden completely thanks to the large cloak he brought in order to cover himself. After he had gotten high enough, Lyle, who had just disguised himself as a noble, quickly crawled into the hall from a small opening and listened into the conversation the prince was about to have with the nobles that had stayed inside. Chapter 33. The Dark Face of the Third Prince. You are listening at novelfull.audio. My prince, what is your command? The old gentleman that had previously been talking with the prince asked as he gracefully bowed down. Ah, those cunts finally left. The prince suddenly said in an uncharacteristic voice as he ran his hand through his hair. What? The nobles asked in confusion as they weren't used to hearing such words coming from the prince himself. I said those bastards who will die in the following couple of days have finally left. You lot should feel happy, however, as your crimes were light enough for me to consider a different form of punishment for you. The prince suddenly said before sighing and looking down at them. This time, the look he was giving wasn't one that a prince would give to those below him, but what a powerful being would give to ants who were walking down on the ground beneath him. It was a look born from incredible arrogance, one that the prince would rarely show to people with whom he wasn't close. Even his late teacher, the god of war, had never seen him show such a look. I always thought there was something eerie hidden beneath that mask of justice and those eyes, Prince Seed. Lyle said in his head as he observed what was happening in the hall. Lyle had previously talked with the prince, who was still wearing his night outfit. Even he had no idea that he was talking with the third prince himself, as he didn't really know the man. He did have a nagging feeling that the person was familiar, but he wasn't certain why so. He had previously gone back to the inn before changing his look and going out. He had a lot of time before morning and he wanted to relax a bit, perhaps even visit a brothel as well. During his walk, he came across some minor nobles who were talking about how they needed to return home as the third prince had suddenly appeared and was calling them all to the hall. That was when things suddenly clicked in Lyle's head. He finally realized why the night was familiar. He had seen the prince a couple of times, most of them being inside the headquarters of the organization. As Lyle was a member of the higher ranks of the organization, he was privy to more information than most. He knew the deal that the Empire and organization had, and would regularly see some higher-ups of the Empire visiting the headquarters through secret entrances. The prince was one of them, as were all the other princes and princesses of the Empire. They all had their own subordinates inside the organization, and the higher ranks were also in cahoots with them. Lyle was one of the rare ones that never took a side, as he didn't wish to get involved in politics. He wasn't interested in holding power in the Empire either. Lyle waited until one of the nobles went home and made his way to the hall before knocking him unconscious and taking his clothes. He blended into the crowd and went in, eager to find out what this whole thing was about. Upon seeing the prince, Lyle had a bad feeling about what was happening. His attitude and the way he simply gave orders to the nobles without punishing them were completely out of character for him. Lyle knew that something was definitely going to happen, something big. Upon seeing that a couple of the nobles were picked out of the crowd to stay, Lyle knew that the prince would probably show his true colors behind closed doors. Even though Lyle had never seen the prince acting in any suspicious way, and had seen and heard of his good deeds and chivalrous acts, he never believed that it was all true. Every single time he would see the prince, he would get a feeling of looking into the abyss. Die, what are you saying, your majesty, why would they? Before a noble could continue talking, the cold stare of the prince made him freeze. It was pure bloodlust and arrogance that could be seen in the deep blue eyes the prince had. From today onwards, you are my dogs, Seed said as he glared at each one of the nobles. There will be no bargains, no deals, just servitude. You will bark when I say you bark, run when I say you run, and follow all my commands without any complaints. If not, I will kill you right now and order to soldiers to take over your possessions, your families will be sent to the dungeon, the females will be violated, as will the men. Seed suddenly started talking with a chilling voice that was unlike how any had heard him talk before. The women will be then sent to work as common prostitutes in the worst brothels while the men will be sent to work in the mines as criminals. I won't even let the children walk away from the crimes your families have committed. Suddenly Seed got up before disappearing from the chair and appearing in front of the nobles who were now petrified in fear and shock. The ones that I have let go will face that destiny, some will have it easier, but some will have it even worse. I won't even let them die before all members of their families have been violated in front of them and their dead bodies delivered in the cells. You dared to not only kiss up to that bastard who had killed my teacher, his own father, but you took advantage and abused your positions, acting as if you were the ones that control the empire. Seed's thunderous roar echoed inside the hall but was blocked from coming out by an array that had been created below the hall. The nobles didn't speak. Not even a sound escaped their lips as they stared at the man who was loved throughout the whole empire because of his charisma, talent, and benevolence. To think that such a person was actually so demented, so cruel that he would say such things. No, it wasn't just saying them, they were all 100% certain that he would do all the things he just said he would. As for Lyle, even he who had some doubts about the prince and his true nature was shocked after hearing the words he spoke. Shit. Lyle thought as he didn't move an inch. Why did I have to listen in? If I get caught, no way that my life will be safe. He won't stop until he kills me, that damn maniac. I don't care about those bastards dying, but the whole family, shit. Lyle cursed in his head. You had to go and listen in, Lyle, you couldn't just let it go, damn it, me and my idiotic mind. Why prince, you. The noble wasn't even able to speak in front of the prince whose murderous intent had covered the whole hall. There had previously been soldiers stationed inside the hall, but the prince had ordered them to leave. As I said, there will be no bargaining, you either bend the knee, swear your loyalty to me and the crown, or you die, Seed said as he grabbed his sword before pulling it out. The Shadowless Blade, that was the name of the sword the prince wielded. A masterwork of craftsmanship that the old duke had ordered to be made specifically for the prince. It was a custom-made sword that was said to be blood-bound to the prince so that only he could wield it. Upon seeing the sword that had been pointed at them, the nobles were all scared senseless. None of them were strong, they were either merchants who became incredibly wealthy or had been a noble house for many generations and were more focused on politics than those that served below them in their houses and trained. That was the usual noble, the leaders usually weren't strong as they didn't have time to train, while the second-in-command and lower were the powerhouses that the house would send out if there was any need for it. Of course, exceptions did exist, like the old duke and a couple of other noble houses that were made out of warriors and never stopped training in developing themselves. Those noble houses, even though they didn't have a lot of political influence in the empire, were incredibly powerful and none dared disrespect them. The royal family was such a family. In the history of the royal family, there were only 3 emperors who had inherited the throne only thanks to their great intellect or leadership skills while having poor strength themselves. The others were all powerful warriors on their own, just like the current emperor who was a titled knight. This one greets his lord. One of the nobles said as he quickly kneeled down and stared at the floor. The others all soon followed, and even though there was some hesitation and unwillingness in their eyes, there was nothing else they could do right now except to kneel down and swear their loyalty to the prince. Chapter 34. Found out you are listening at novelfull.audio. To say that the nobles were terrified would be an understatement. They understood that from this day onwards, they would be tied to the prince, and if he was to ever fall from grace, so would they. Still, it was better than having their entire family get completely destroyed. They knew what they had done, and they knew that the prince could definitely do what he had told them he would do to the other noble families. "Oh, I forgot to mention one thing," Seed suddenly said as he looked down at the nobles. "The marriage contracts you had with the other families," Seed spoke whilst continuing to look down at the nobles before flashing a small smile on his face. You, and you." He pointed at 3 nobles. "The marriage between your daughter and the young John will proceed, as will the marriages of your 2 sons and the ladies Sophia and Lien," Seed said as he looked at the nobles. "Those haven't done bad, their families also aren't as corrupt as the other ones, so I will let the marriage proceed, and I will not capture the 3, but as for the others, they will all be annulled after the operation." The 3 nobles nodded at the prince, but they cursed him inside. The only reason why they were going to marry their children was because of the benefits they would receive after being connected to the other noble families with the marriage. Since the families would all get captured, their possessions seized and their titles were taken away, what value did those 3 have? None. They had no value to them, but they knew that the prince was doing this on purpose as they were the 3 strongest nobles amongst the group that had sworn the oath. By making them continue with the worthless marriages, he would make sure that they wouldn't be able to grow too large for him to control. "Alright, now that we have solved that, let's sign those blood contracts," Seed said in a cheerful voice as he clapped his hands. A person entered the hall, holding a couple of contracts with him. "Your Majesty." The man who was dressed in a butler uniform bowed as he presented the contracts to Seed. Upon seeing the man, Lyle was shocked. He made sure that he made no sound and that his mana was completely isolated inside him as to not be found out by the old butler. The butler's name was Reginald O'Brien. He was chosen to be the 3rd prince's butler when the former was 10 years old and had served him diligently ever since. He was also one of the rare people that knew the prince's true nature and had the prince's complete trust. But that didn't matter much to Lyle. What did matter, however, was the man's strength. He was a golden knight, and not just any golden knight, but one of the most powerful ones in the empire. He had reached the realm of golden knight at 29 years of age, only 3 years longer than what the old duke who was said to be a genius. He was now 40 years old and was at the peak of the realm. People expected him to break through the next realm relatively soon. Even though one could officially become a high-ranking individual in the empire upon reaching the realm of a titled knight, the old butler had already made it clear that he would continue serving as the butler of the young prince until he was no longer able to be of use. The prince had managed to reach the realm of a silver knight at 20 years of age. He had broken the record and became the youngest to ever do so. Even Lyle, who had the advantage of his incredible bloodline, was only able to reach the realm at 21 years of age. Lyle was incredibly excited and happy that day. He had after all broken the record that the old duke and a couple of other geniuses throughout the history of the empire had put. But then, just a couple of days later, he heard the news of the young prince Side breaking through the Silver Knight realm, officially becoming the youngest to ever do it. Seed was a monster when it came to talent, that much was certain. Even the old duke had praised him and said numerous times that he would become even more powerful than he or any other person in the empire in the future. Upon hearing the prince's words and seeing the contracts that he had taken, all the nobles were taken aback and visibly shaken. A blood contract wasn't a small matter. It bound 2 people together, and if one was to break the terms of the contract, they would die. That much was unquestionable, and there had only been rare occasions on the planet when one was able to nullify the contract. The nobles simply swallowed any disagreements they had and signed the blood contracts. They knew that there was no way out of their present situation. The prince had made that quite clear to them. It was only after they had done that that they were finally allowed to leave the hall and go home. They all hurried home as each wanted to have a family meeting. They wouldn't tell them anything about what had happened while they were talking with the prince in private. They knew that it could leak out and alarm other noble houses, which was something that they not only didn't want to happen, but they couldn't since the contract obliged them to keep all of the prince's secret, amongst many other things. The contract itself was long and without any loopholes, at least there weren't any loopholes from what they could see during the brief time they could check the contracts. As for Lyle, who was observing the whole thing from above, he slowly started crawling backward as he attempted to leave the area. With Reginald present, Lyle had no faith in himself being able to conceal himself for much longer. Even now, he was constantly keeping full focus on keeping his mana concealed, and even though his bloodline allowed him to basically empower himself without mana, he needed blood nearby in order to do that. As Lyle was moving back and making sure that nobody would be able to notice him, Reginald briefly glanced at where he had previously been before looking at the prince. "My prince, a rat has been present. I'm ashamed to say that I only noticed him now. Should I take care of him now?" "No, not now. Go out and try to see who it is. If it's somebody unfamiliar, follow him before eliminating him and everybody present. If it's somebody whose face you know, first come back to me." "Yes, my prince." Reginald bowed down before disappearing from the spot. As Lyle managed to crawl out and get down on the ground, he was completely unaware that he was being observed by Reginald. Well, at least he was unaware at the beginning. Soon a nagging feeling at the back of his head started appearing. Lyle knew what was happening. He was being watched. He simply acted as if he didn't notice anything and continued on his way, moving towards the mansion of the noble he had previously knocked out. The noble should still be knocked unconscious, and he was first planning on giving back his clothes. Of course, if he was still being followed, he wouldn't do that. That was another reason why Lyle had dared to listen in to the prince. With his current appearance, even the prince would have to think twice before simply killing him. A noble having enough skill to listen in as Lyle did was nothing to scoff at. The prince would first have to think about whether the noble had any partners, and he would first try to follow him before getting rid of everybody that might be connected. The feeling of being watched soon disappeared, luckily. Lyle upped his pace before arriving at the alley where he had dumped the unconscious noble. He made sure to inject the noble with a sleeping agent that he had. As an assassin, Lyle, of course, had a couple of different potions and items with him. Some were sleeping agents, some were poison. As for Reginald, he had returned to the prince and had told him of what he had seen. A noble actually sneaked in and listened to my conversation, and he was skillful enough that you barely managed to notice him," Seed said as he closed his eyes. "Got to his mansion, kill everybody present. I don't survivors, nor do I want evidence of a golden knight doing the deed." "Yes, your majesty." Reginald bowed down before leaving the hall. He wasn't in a hurry to get to the mansion as the noble should take some time to return. He had already thrown a small device at the noble in order to track him. Even though Lyle was once a Tier 2 assassin, he would have still been unable to feel the tracker sticking to his clothes, not to mention right now. Lyle arrived and quickly put on the noble's clothes back on him. He then used a pill, one that would get rid of the sleeping agent and wake the noble up before leaving the area. Chapter 35. The Annihilation of a Noble House. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As morning came, the city was found shocked yet again. The Duke had been assassinated just a couple of days ago, which led to the royal soldiers coming into the city and occupying the castle in order to investigate what had happened. And now another tragedy struck. Well, calling those two things tragedies was a bit of an overestimation, as nobody amongst the citizen really liked the Duke, nor most of the nobles. But what had happened during the late night hours was something that nobody had ever expected to happen in the city. The noble house of Johansson, one of the medium-sized noble houses of the dukedom, had been destroyed. Hell, destroyed would be an underestimation of what had happened. Annihilated would be more fitting. The head of the house, alongside his entire family, guards, private troops, and servants were all dead. Nobody knew what happened or how it happened, Some servants who had been outside of the mansion had returned in the morning and found everybody dead. Their throats were slit, hearts pierced, and some even had their entire bodies crushed to pieces. The scene was horrifying, and the royal guards quickly ran to the scene in order to block everybody from coming in and perhaps even tampering with any evidence the perpetrator had left. There, however, was no evidence. Not even a strand of hair of the perpetrator had been left at the scene. The commander personally came, and after seeing the state the bodies were in, was shocked. The most powerful being in the noble house was a low-grade silver knight who had barely been able to reach the realm and had been stuck at it for years with no way of improving. Still, the old soldier was well respected by many since there had only been 3 golden knights present in the dukedom during the old duke's reign. The 3 had all left after Orsted took over after his father's death, and upon seeing just how the young duke was behaving, and trying to correct him on numerous occasions without any success, they left. Silver knights were considered incredibly powerful in the dukedom, and seeing one dead was not something that usually happened. "The heart has been crushed, sir," the soldier that inspected the bodies before said as he stood next to the commander. The commander simply nodded before crouching and inspecting the body by himself. "It wasn't done by a weapon, see how the flesh has some tears around the hole of the chest?" The commander asked the soldier, who furrowed his brows and crouched down to look at what the commander was pointing at. "Yes, I do see tears, but it could have been a weapon that." "No, no weapon, this was done by using bare hands. I know it since I could have done the same thing, albeit with more error," the commander said as the soldier gulped. "Sir, you mean to say the killer is a golden knight, and one that was probably more powerful than I am?" The commander nodded before standing up. "But sir, why would a golden knight come here? Why would a person with such power do something as horrible as this?" the soldier said as he pointed at a small hill of bodies in front of them. The silver knight was placed on the ground in front of the small hill, while the head of the house, Victor Johansson, was placed on the top of the hill. His eyes were wide open in shock as his throat was open, but it wasn't slit open, no. It was more likely that the golden knight had grabbed his throat before using his bare hands to tear it open. "I don't know, I need to contact the higher.ups, something is going on here. First it was the disappearance of the Archmage, then the Killman arriving with bad news, the appearance of a person that was above a titled knight, and now this is turning out to be way above our capabilities," the commander said with his face scrunched up in worry. He knew that if the killer wanted to, he could probably kill him and the whole company by himself. He wasn't that worried about that happening, as there would be no purpose for the perpetrator doing such a thing, except for wishing for death, as touching the royal soldiers meant that an archmage or a title knight would arrive and use everything they had to capture the individual. But the problem was the fact that the third prince was here. The prince came without any guards and was completely alone. The commander had that thought as nobody except for Lyle and the nobles that had signed a blood contract knew of Reginald's presence in the city. The old butler knew that the prince didn't want anybody to suspect anything, so he wouldn't show himself in the city. Lyle had woken up some time ago and upon learning the news of what had happened, was slightly terrified. "He followed me last night, shit," Lyle thought before calming himself down. "No, wait, had he been following me the whole night, it would have been me that died, not the noble." He recognized the face and went to the mansion, killing everybody present. No, that wouldn't be quite correct. He had no way of knowing whether the noble would return back home, so how did he? Lyle's eyes suddenly opened wide in shock as he realized what had happened. "The clothes, damn, he put something on the clothes I was wearing. Damn it, I was too lucky last night, way too lucky," Lyle thought as he gulped in fear. The old butler was strong, even back at his peak, Lyle would have never been able to defeat such an opponent. "I need to be more careful in the future. I also need to leave this city as soon as I reach the realm of Bronze Knight. Hell, I might not even wait that long," Lyle said before looking out of the window. It was daytime. He had come back much earlier than expected last night, and even when he returned back to the inn, it was still night. He woke up during the afternoon, which meant that he had quite some time to kill before going to the forest. On the other hand, why even wait? I don't need to sneak out of the city anymore. Lyle suddenly told himself before starting to put on his disguise. He didn't know what the prince was planning on doing in the city, and neither did he care. What he did care about was what would happen to him and his alias. For now, he doubted the prince would try to do anything to him. He had returned last night when the prince was present at the gate. Even though the transformation had ended, there were still residual traces of his aura on his body. It didn't matter if the prince thought it was the aura of whatever powerful being had appeared or his own, it would be enough to even hold back the old butler. That was exactly what had happened. Upon killing everybody in the mansion last night, Reginald returned and gave Sid his report about what he found. Which was nothing. No clues. No suspicious individuals. Nothing. Sid decided that they would need to be a bit more careful in the future. He also told Reginald about what had happened at the gate. The old butler was shocked to find out that the killman had actually come across such a powerful person in the forest outside the city. The prince had given him the order to not, under any circumstances, go against the killman. I don't know why, but I have a feeling that even you would die if you fought against him. The aura I felt on him, as brief as it was, made me shake a bit in fear, and this man was in the presence of such a powerful being, and nothing happened to him. It seemed like he wasn't in the least bothered by the aura. Without even knowing it, Lyle had given his second identity in the city a perfect cover. He quickly scanned the outside of his window before going out. The staff of the inn had already grown accustomed to him rarely leaving his room and never came inside it. He wasn't the only one that did so, so they didn't suspect a thing. As Lyle approached the gate under the disguise of being a killman, the soldiers all slightly bowed to him before he nodded at them and went out. They had all known that he was powerful, but after what had happened last night, they were certain that the person in front of them was at the very least a peak golden knight, if not even a titled knight. Lyle simply went out before heading to the forest. Last night was bad when it came to improving his strength, so he was going to spend more time inside and hunt more powerful monsters this time. Chapter 36. A system mission. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Damn, I might have stumbled upon something big here. Lyle said to himself as he was crouching atop a tree and watching down at a large group of goblins and hobgoblins. The goblins and hobgoblins were sitting down on the ground while primitive cages could be seen around them. There were some beasts and monsters that were inside the cages, while a cave that was a couple of meters from the monsters seemed to contain even more. Suddenly screams could be heard as Lyle looked back. He couldn't see anybody since the sound was far away, but it was slowly coming closer to him. Lyle simply waited patiently. The screams became louder and louder, and Lyle could tell that it was probably humans that were making them, both males and females. After a couple of seconds, he was able to see a peculiar sight. A group of hobgoblins was bringing 3 girls and 2 guys with them. The humans seemed to only be about 18 to 19 years old, and from looking at their old and worn-out clothes, Lyle could guess that they were from a nearby village. They have already started attacking the nearby villages. That's too fast. They should still be fearful of the city guards. Was it because of me? Lyle suddenly thought back on what happened yesterday. He had used his transformation and the incredible aura of a vampire lord. A tier 6 being was released, making the whole forest and the city aware of his existence. The powerful aura definitely scared the monsters, but it might have also forced their primal urges to kick in. Monsters and animals were bred in order to leave descendants after they died. The presence of a much more powerful monster might have urged the monsters in the forest to breed and pass on their genes much faster than usual. Ding! The host has found a mysterious site. Thanks to the host transforming and releasing the aura of a vampire lord, the monsters in the forest had started acting erratically, especially those like goblins and hobgoblins that needed humans or other humanoid creatures to mate. The system asks the host to defeat the group of hobgoblins in front of him and to destroy their outpost. The system will give the host the following rewards for doing so. 60s coins. 1 level up. The host will be able to gain a beginner-level book of poisons, a book of poisons. Lyle suddenly widened his eyes after seeing the final reward. TCH, you're doing this on purpose, aren't you? Lyle asked the system but only got silence as a response. He needed that book. He had a lot of flasks and small bottles that contained poison from Ilya and had no idea what each one did. The book, although it might not help him with identifying all the poisons, might help him out with at least figuring out what some of them might do and how powerful they were. Also, since it said that it was a beginner-level book, there probably existed those of a higher level as well. Who knows whether the system would reward him with better ones in the future. Lyle looked down on the goblins and hobgoblins and first waited until the new additions entered the cave. From outside, one wasn't able to see just how large the cave is, but after the party entered, the sounds of screaming became less and less audible until Lyle was barely able to hear them anymore. TCH, if the sound really became this quiet because of the distance, then the cave has to be massive, or goes down and has some tunnels, that will be a bother to deal with. Lyle thought as he looked down at the goblins and hobgoblins that were down in front of the cave. He was now level 16 as he had already spent a couple of hours in the forest hunting monsters and leveling up. Lyle first had to deal with the monsters in front of the cave before entering the cave. But simply attacking them wouldn't be good as the ones in the cave would be alerted of his presence. He already had a general idea of what he would be able to find inside the cave and knew that if he was to enter stealthily, he would probably be able to kill half if not even more than half of the monsters inside before being found out. 6 goblins and 2 hobgoblins, it should be doable. Lyle said as he counted out the number of monsters that were outside. The goblins stuck together most of the time, but there were occasions when they would leave each other's side. As for the hobgoblins who were taller and stronger compared to the goblins, they mostly kept to themselves. They didn't even stand together and were divided in 3 directions, with each one doing something else. One of the hobgoblins was roasting something on a small fire they had, another was using a stick to annoy a wolf that they had caught and the third one was sitting down and watching the forest. Killing those 3 without being noticed would be easy once the goblins were dead, but he first needed to do that without alerting any of them. The first target showed itself soon. One of the goblins departed from the group and went to the forest as he had apparently seen something. It was a small flower that the goblin had noticed and wanted to take it for some reason. Lyle didn't care what reason the little monster had as this was a perfect opportunity to kill it. He glanced at the other monsters, and upon seeing that none of them were paying attention to the goblins, he quickly moved from the tree and went down without creating any noise. He then quickly appeared behind the goblin and with one swift slash, he cut off its head. Lyle quickly grabbed the head and the headless body before going deeper inside the forest and hiding the body in a bush while keeping the head. He stared at the goblin's head in his hand before a creepy smile appeared on his face. He glanced back at the body before his smile deepened even further. About 2 minutes later, one of the goblins from the group looked around before seeing their companion that had gone into the forest. The goblin looked at him with slight confusion as the latter was waving him over with a weird expression on its face. The goblin was behind a tree, which felt incredibly weird for the other one. It got up from the ground, mumbled something to the other goblins who were currently feasting on some flesh and went to check out why the other one was calling out to him. As the goblin came closer to the one behind the tree, the latter suddenly disappeared behind it. The goblin was again confused but continued further until he was at the tree. Coming around it, the goblin was surprised to see that nobody was there. It looked around, before spotting something very weird. It spotted blood on the ground, and not a small amount. It suddenly gulped before looking up. Its eyes widened in shock and it opened its mouth, only for a spear to penetrate through it and the rest of its body before stabbing through the ground below it. Lyle quickly came down and pulled his spear lightly, which only went out of the ground. He then lifted it and looked at the goblin, which looked like a shish kebab. He quickly went up the tree before removing the spear from the body and using some thread to tie the corpse to a branch. Right next to the corpse was a goblin's head and an arm that Lyle had cut off from the first one he had killed. He then proceeded to use his ability and coat the tips of his throwing knives and daggers with the blood of the dead goblin. There were 4 goblins left, and Lyle knew that using the same tactic again wouldn't work. They would soon notice that the 2 of them had disappeared, and even with the low intelligence the goblins had, they would understand that something was wrong. Goblins were meek creatures that would get scared easily, and Lyle wasn't about to let them get scared by the disappearance of the 2 and raise an alarm or alert the hobgoblins who were currently not paying any attention to them. He quickly moved and got atop a tree that was closest to the group of goblins. He first held a stone in his hand before throwing it. The stone fell to the ground and the goblins looked in the direction where the faint sound came from. 2 of them turned around, and it was at that point that the 2 goblins behind them suddenly stiffened up and rolled their eyes backward before falling down on the ground. 2 throwing knives were stuck in their heads, and after hitting them, Lyle used his ability to make the blood on them explode and destroy the goblins' brains. The moment they fell, Lyle appeared behind the 2 goblins that had turned around previously. Before the 2 could turn around after hearing the sound of 2 bodies falling down, their heads flew through the air as Lyle had decapitated them. The goblins were below level 10 and barely gave him any soul power, but it was fine. Lyle didn't stand, he quickly moved to the hobgoblins. The one that was playing with the wolf didn't hear anything, while the one that was staring at the forest was turning around. Before the hobgoblins were able to fully turn around, a spear penetrated through his back and destroyed his heart while Lyle threw one of his daggers that were coated in blood at the one that was roasting meat. The dagger hit the hobgoblin and penetrated through the throat before Lyle used mana and made the blood explode and destroy his neck completely. That was when the final hobgoblin finally realized something had happened. He was able to hear the one closest to him fall down as the wolf he was annoying quieted down after Lyle had appeared. The hobgoblin turned around and was horrified to see everybody had been killed. Before it could do anything, however, Lyle appeared in front of him. The hobgoblin used the stick in his hand to try and block Lyle's dagger, only for the dagger to easily cut through the stick and open his throat. Lyle then quickly spun the knife in his hand and used it in a reverse grip before stabbing down at the hobgoblin and penetrating through its eye. The monsters were all dead. Chapter 37. Bonus chapter, Inside the Goblin Cave. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hiya. Lyle exhaled as he went to get the bodies. He had spent a bit more mana than expected in order to make his blood explode. It was still, however, less of an amount compared to before when his bloodline hadn't evolved. Lyle could feel his mana as well had grown. He couldn't be completely certain, but he could almost swear that he didn't have this much mana before. But, there was still something missing. Lyle could sense that something deep inside him was still somehow shackled, he just didn't know what it was. He gathered the bodies quickly before hiding them up the trees. Lyle had no idea if more goblins or hobgoblins would be returning, and he didn't want them to sound an alarm after seeing all the corpses on the ground in front of their hideout. Upon doing all of that, Lyle glanced around and looked at the monsters that were caged up. The monsters were all silent right now. They could sense great danger coming from Lyle, who was simply passing by their cages, completely uninterested when it came to them. Lyle entered the cave. The inside of the cave was actually quite narrow, but it led further inside. Lyle made his way in. The screaming from the humans that were inside could still be heard. It was only a couple of seconds later that Lyle constricted his eyes and jumped up before using his daggers to stab into the hard rock of the tunnel and stick to the walls above. 2 hobgoblins were passing by. The 2 were talking about something, but Lyle of course didn't understand their language, so he simply waited until they were right below him to drop down from the wall and kill the 2. His daggers were truly showing their power here. The daggers were created for being used against much stronger opponents, and those like hobgoblins would have no way to even block the sharp daggers. Lyle did the same with the 2 hobgoblins as he did before. He used a thin thread to hang them on the wall of the tunnel before continuing deeper inside. They were not perfectly hidden and perhaps enemies could notice them after entering the tunnel, but Lyle wasn't about to constantly go out to hide the bodies before returning inside the cave. Suddenly the cave became wider, and not just a bit, but a lot wider. The ceiling also became higher compared to before in the tunnel, and Lyle could even see some primitive buildings that the monsters had built from rocks and sticks in the large underground hideout he had entered. The area was about the size of a football pitch. Author. I'm European, so when I say football, I don't mean the American one, no hate for that though, do like watching it. The primitive buildings that the monsters had created had two purposes. Some were for sleeping, and the others were for holding the prisoners and breeding. That was it, there was nothing else that the buildings were used for or any other purpose they had. The screams of girls and guys echoed inside the large cave while the laughter and moans of the goblins and hobgoblins were mixed in them. Lyle quickly went to work. There were about 10 goblins and 5 hobgoblins that were currently outside, while there were definitely even more that were currently partaking in different activities inside the buildings. A couple of the shacks that the monsters had created were incredibly close to Lyle, who went to them first. He arrived at one before opening the door, or to be more exact, he pushed the door to the side as it was just a large plank that wasn't even connected to the building. A hobgoblin and 2 goblins were inside the small shack while a girl was pinned down beneath the hobgoblin. The 2 small goblins held her hands, which were bleeding thanks to their nails that were digging inside her flesh. The hobgoblin was enjoying himself as he moved his hips and indulged in ravaging the girl, who was barely even able to scream or produce any sound anymore. Blood could be seen going down her legs, signifying that this was how she had her first time. Lyle quickly threw 2 of his throwing knives at the goblins before grabbing the hobgoblin from behind. He didn't kill him right away. He didn't know why, but he didn't want to give the monster that swift of a death. He pulled the hobgoblin back before using his dagger to cut off the thing between his legs. The hobgoblin tried to scream, only for his throat to be almost crushed by Lyle, who had grabbed it with full force before stabbing through it with his other dagger. Lyle then pushed the hobgoblin against a wall and stabbed through his heart, ending his life. He looked at the girl, who was simply staring at him. "You're safe, but don't move, I need to take care of the other monsters, just stay here, all right?" Lyle asked the girl as the latter's lips trembled before she simply nodded her head meekly. Lyle proceeded to spend the following 10 minutes slowly moving around the hideout and getting rid of the hobgoblins and goblins that were indulging themselves in carnal pleasure. There were about 2 shacks left, but he wouldn't be able to get to them since they were in the center of the cave where the other goblins and hobgoblins were located at. "That's it for being stealthy, I guess," Lyle said as he prepared himself for battle. The shacks at the center of the cave were larger compared to the others, and there were definitely more monsters inside. There were even a couple of cages that he saw inside the hideout that had people inside of them. In total, he had come across about 10 people that were in shacks and 3 that were in cages. He had no way of taking out the remaining monsters without alerting them. Well, there were some things he could do to not alert them and get rid of a couple of them, but it was simply too time consuming, and his mana would drop down to dangerous levels after that. Simply going head on against the rest was the better tactic this time around. Right before Lyle was about to move and attack the monsters, he stopped as he felt a mana fluctuation coming from one of the big shacks in the center. He wasn't the only one, as even the hobgoblin stared at the shack before it suddenly exploded. 2 hobgoblins and 3 goblins were blasted out from the shack as a man walked out from the debris that was falling around. A girl could be seen lying on a makeshift bed that was made out of wood and leaves. Tears could be seen falling down her face as her clothes were ripped apart. The man, on the other hand, had a big cut across his chest and a lot of blood was flowing out from it. Lyle could guess that he had struggled fiercely inside the shack, which led to the hobgoblins getting annoyed by him and cutting him down in an attempt to kill him. "These 2, they were amongst the 5 that I saw getting dragged inside previously," Lyle thought as he stared at the 2 before the door of another shack was opened and more goblins and hobgoblins came out. From the open door of the large shack, Lyle could see 2 girls that were lying on a bed while the body of a man was next to them. All 3 were alive, but it was obvious what had taken place inside the other shack. And those would be the other three that were in the same group. But this guy, he was able to use mana. Lyle asked himself as he stared at the young man who was drawing mana to him. The man saw the inside of the shack and his eyes turned bloodshot as he lifted his hand and pointed at the shack before a concentrated blast of mana went at the hobgoblins that had come out. The hobgoblins were blasted away, but that was the only thing that happened. It would take much to kill them. The goblins on the other hand were either seriously injured or dead after being blasted away like that. The young man suddenly started panting heavily before falling down on his knees. He had already suffered a grave injury, and the exhaustion that using mana at his level was incredible. The monsters all shouted before charging at him, only for the hobgoblins that were closest to the man to be penetrated by a spear that stabbed down on the ground beneath him. The monsters all stopped moving. The spear and the dead body of the hobgoblin made them nervous suddenly. The young man that was barely keeping consciousness suddenly looked up as a person appeared in front of him. "Hey, just do your best to not lose consciousness, I'll take care of these guys," Lyle said as he glanced back at the young man who was staring at him in confusion and shock. Chapter 38. Fighting inside the cave. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Who are you?" The young man said before suddenly wincing out of pain as the mana that had been spiraling toward him dispersed around him. "Just focus on surviving, I have already stopped your bleeding, but honestly, that wound doesn't look good," Lyle said as he glanced down at the young man before turning his sight to the monsters who were snarling at him. He took out two of his throwing knives and started walking toward the goblins and hobgoblins. "Don't worry, this'll be over quickly," Lyle said before throwing the knives and breaking into a sprint. The daggers found their targets and lodged themselves deeply in the heads of two goblins that fell down on the ground while Lyle quickly took out his two daggers and attacked a hobgoblin that was near his spear. Lyle had taken them by surprise and most of the monsters didn't have any weapons on them, only 3 of the hobgoblins had a weapon, a normal sword each. The goblins usually used their bare hands, sticks, rock knives that they had created, and similar things. They were at the bottom of the food chain and most monsters at the same level could deal with a goblin in a 1.1 battle. The hobgoblin tried to punch Lyle, only to miss as Lyle swiftly sidestepped before trying to stab the monster through the neck. The hobgoblin turned out to be a bit better than expected and actually dodged the attack, only suffering a small cut on the side of his neck. Lyle had already extended his arm and a part of his body in an attempt to stab the hobgoblin, which led to him being open for an attack. Or at least that's what the hobgoblin thought. Lyle quickly turned to the side and pointed his left heel at the hobgoblin before delivering a spinning back kick with his right leg. He connected with the stomach of the monster that quickly spat out air as he was sent back by about 1.5 meters, 5 feet. As the hobgoblin fell to the ground, Lyle quickly threw the dagger he held with his left hand and another hobgoblin before grabbing his spear. The dagger hit the hobgoblin in the chest as the latter was charging at Lyle and didn't expect the attack to happen so quickly. It flinched and stopped for a moment before glancing down at the dagger. The hobgoblin released an angry growl and grabbed the dagger before pulling it out. His actions were futile, however, as a spear penetrated the other side of his chest the same moment he pulled the dagger out. "Never lose sight of your opponent, you moron," Lyle said with a deadpan expression before suddenly jumping in the air and kicking the dagger the hobgoblin had released from his hand at another goblin and taking out the spear from the hobgoblin whose chest he had penetrated. There had been a total of 10 hobgoblins and 17 goblins at the start of the battle. Now there were 8 hobgoblins and 14 goblins left, with one hobgoblin just standing up right now after suffering the kick from Lyle. "Easy does it," Lyle said as he dodged a flurry of attack that a hobgoblin had launched. He then quickly kneeled and propped up his spear, which made the hobgoblin who was charging at him while attacking simply run into the spear and stab himself. Lyle then quickly let go of the spear before jumping back as 2 other hobgoblins and 3 goblins charged at him from the front. He took out 2 more throwing knives before throwing them at the goblins and managing to kill one while the second was only wounded as the knife hit the shoulder. "TCH, don't tell me I'm losing my touch." Lyle thought as he quickly moved to the side and ducked to dodge a swing of a sword before slashing the side of the hobgoblin. Blood started gushing out from the cut as the hobgoblin held his side and kneeled down while letting go of the sword that another one quickly picked up. Lyle smirked before charging at the hobgoblin, who panicked before trying to stab Lyle. Lyle suddenly went down and slid between the hobgoblin's legs before stabbing them. He didn't wait and quickly jumped at the hobgoblin that was kneeling before stabbing him in the neck. The action wasn't a complete success as 3 goblins suddenly jumped on top of Lyle. 2 grabbed his legs while the last one grabbed his right hand that was holding the dagger. Annoying little things. Lyle cursed as he got up from the ground with some difficulty, only to be knocked down by another hobgoblin that jumped on top of him and started punching him in the face. Without the goblins noticing, a bunch of blood had appeared next to Lyle's left hand before it started transforming into a crude spear. Lyle did his best to dodge the punches by moving his head, but it wasn't easy and more enemies were charging at him. He then quickly grabbed the blood spear that he just created and stabbed the hobgoblin through the neck before throwing him to the side. He used the spear to stab the hobgoblin that was holding his right arm before getting rid of the other 2 as well. 4 hobgoblins and 10 goblins remained. Well, the hobgoblin that Lyle stabbed between the legs was still alive, but it wouldn't really be able to fight anymore, at least not during this battle. The other monsters were now visibly shaken up and were hesitating. The enemy that had shown up had killed so many of them in such a short period of time. To the goblins, it was unthinkable, Lyle seemed to be on the same level as some of the hobgoblins, but he was able to kill them as if they were nothing. They were correct, Lyle was the same level as some of them, while there were some that were 1 or 2 levels above him. But Lyle had a lot more experience when it came to fighting, not to mention that his armor and weapons were of incredible quality as well. One of the hobgoblins had taken Lyle's spear while another took his dagger before staring at him. All of the hobgoblins were now armed, while some of the goblins had picked up rocks and even the knives that had been stuck in the skulls of their brethren and stared at him. That's not a bad idea, taking my weapons, but none of you are worthy of wielding them. Do you even know how to use them correctly? Lyle asked as he started walking toward them. His face was bruised and some blood was coming out from his nose as the hobgoblin from before managed to hit him a couple of times. I'll admit it, for monsters that are a head shorter than me, Lyle said as he stared at the hobgoblins that had deep green or light red skin, you guys sure do hit hard. Lyle cranked his neck before sprinting at the hobgoblin that was holding his spear. He then suddenly stopped before throwing his blood spear and another hobgoblin that had his dagger. The short dagger was the worst weapon that they could use in order to defend themselves, and as such, the spear penetrated through his right forearm and continued further, piercing through the shoulder as well before suddenly disappearing and leaving 2 holes that were about half an inch in diameter. The hobgoblin immediately started bleeding while Lyle took on the one that held his spear. The hobgoblin immediately tried to stab Lyle, only for the attack to miss by a millimeter as Lyle simply moved his head to the side before closing the distance. Good idea, but don't try to stab the head without being fully certain that you will hit, Lyle said as he came about half a meter close to the hobgoblin. He quickly grabbed the right arm of the hobgoblin with his free, left hand before stabbing through the arm with his dagger. He then quickly took out the dagger and the serrated side tore the flesh and skin of the arm before he stabbed the monster through the neck. He didn't come unscathed, however, as the hobgoblin managed to headbutt him at the same time he stabbed his neck. The forehead of the hobgoblin managed to hit his nose, which led to Lyle being disoriented for a brief moment while his nose bled even more. He quickly pulled out his dagger and used his left arm, which was still grabbing onto the hobgoblin's arm, to grab the spear as well and jumped back. He stumbled during the jump back as 2 goblins appeared behind him, trying to stab him. The 3 all fell together and the goblin quickly stabbed Lyle, only to be unable to penetrate through his combat suit. Good idea, but you should have aimed at my head, Lyle said before stabbing one through the neck while hitting the forehead of the other one with the butt of his spear. He quickly rose to the ground and stabbed the second goblin before lifting his spear and throwing the goblin at another one, making them both fall down on the ground. Well, look at how few of you remain, Lyle said as he smiled dangerously. His nose was bleeding furiously and fell down to his mouth, dyeing his teeth red. His smile made the monsters all stop for a moment as they were scared of the human that was standing in front of them. To them, Lyle looked like a demon that had come to take their very souls. Chapter 39. Adam, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Phew, well that's over with, Lyle said as he took out a knife from a goblin's head before putting it back in a small sheath that was on his waist. Lyle kept most of the throwing knives in the spatial ring, but he liked to have a couple of them on him as well since there were certain times when one couldn't use the ring. Plus, it was simply something he had grown accustomed to ever since he had become an assassin. Going into battle without a couple of throwing knives on him just didn't feel right. Lyle then went back to the group of people who were kneeling down and tending to the wounded young man. Hey, all of you can come out now, the monsters are dead. Lyle shouted and his voice echoed inside the giant cave. The people that had been captured had all seen him before and were all hoping that he could truly kill all the monsters and set them free. Upon hearing his shout, all of the people suddenly came out of the shacks and cages that Lyle had previously opened for them. Lyle's arms had a couple of cuts on them and his face was a bit more bruised up with a cut that was above his left eye. He had almost lost the eye after a goblin managed to somehow throw his knife almost perfectly and nearly blind him. Lyle came to the group of 5 who were all staring at him before kneeling down. Even though I have managed to stop the bleeding, I'm afraid I only managed to slow down his death. The wound goes quite deep, Lyle said as he looked at the wound that the man had suffered. Sir, please, can you help him, please, we'll do anything you ask. The girl who was inside the shack together with the young man pleaded as she put her head on the floor whilst begging Lyle. Sorry, but that won't work, I have no use for any of you, Lyle said in a calm manner before looking at the man who was smiling at him. That was a cool fight. The man said before suddenly coughing out blood. So, there's no hope for me, huh? Smiled the young man as he stared into Lyle's eyes, seemingly unbothered by his approaching death. Tell me, where did you train? Train. The mana blasts you previously used, how taught them to you? You mean that, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm just a normal villager, I don't even remember much of what happened, I just saw that those monsters were about to defile Cindy and I just snapped, I suddenly felt power rush to me and, well the next thing I remember is sending some sort of wave to the monsters and blasting them off before finding myself on the ground and you in front of me. Never trained, Lyle said as his eyes widened slightly before he took another look at the young man. Give me your hand, and what's your name? Lyle said as he took the young man's hand and started checking his body with mana. I'm Adam, sir, Adam said before suddenly violently coughing again. Blood came out of his mouth and dyed the rags he was in red before he started panting. This guy, no mistaking it, he has a high affinity toward mana. If he had been found by mages or knights earlier in his life, he would have already reached the realm of a bronze knight. Lyle thought as he checked Adam's body. Adam. The girl that was with Adam in the shack, Cindy, cried out before hugging him and weeping. There is a way. Lyle suddenly said as he let go of Adam. There is a way for you to survive, and not only survive but become powerful beyond what you ever even dreamed of, Lyle said as he stared deeply into Adam's eyes. The latter stared back before sighing. And what would I need to do in order to survive? I'm worth nothing, sir, I'm just a normal farmer that lives off the land and helps out his parents alongside my other siblings. I have nothing of value to give you, nothing at all. I only need one thing, and that is you, Lyle said as he smirked, leaving Adam and the others confused. You, sorry, but what do you? Before Adam could even respond, Cindy stared back at Lyle with anger before shouting. What, you want him to be some toy for you, some doll that will indulge in all your fantasies, and don't play dumb, I know what sick things the nobles do, I won't let you do that to Adam, I won't, no, I didn't mean it like that, Lyle said as he sighed before looking at them. I can save you, but from that point on, your life is mine, you will follow me and be my personal guard, nothing more, nothing less, Lyle said while fully knowing that if Adam was to agree with him, he could indeed make him do anything he wanted him to do, but he doubted it would ever come to that. "Your guard?" Adam asked with a weak voice as he looked at Lyle weirdly. He had seen how the man had been able to destroy the whole base of goblins and hobgoblins by himself, and now he was supposed to be the guard of such a being. "Well, more of a servant, but once again, I will not force you to do anything you do not want to do, but there are things you will need to let go after taking my offer, them for example," Lyle said as he pointed at Cindy and the others. "You will probably never see them again, not just them, but your village, your parents, everybody you know will be a thing of the past." Adam looked at Lyle before looking at the others who all nodded at him. "If you die, you will never see us again anyway, this way, who knows, you might have a chance to at least say hi in the future." The other guy said as he smiled weakly at Adam. "Never again." "Probably, but who knows, we might pass by this area in the future, you will of course have a chance to visit them if you so wish to," Lyle said as he nodded to Adam before turning serious. "You only have a couple of minutes left to live, you have to make your choice quickly otherwise you will die." Adam stayed silent and looked at his friends before glancing back at Adam, this time with conviction in his eyes. "I accept, I don't know who you are, or why you would save me, but you have already saved our lives once, if I survive, I will follow you to hell itself, sir." Lyle simply smiled before looking at everybody that was present. "Everybody needs to leave and wait for us outside." The people all looked at him with confusion before walking toward the exit. Some, however, were fearful and didn't know whether they should get out. "I have killed all the monsters that were outside, you can just wait in the tunnel, but if any remain after a minute has passed, I will personally kill you," Lyle said as he released his killing intent for a split second, making everybody freeze before running to the exit. They could see that he wasn't joking, if they truly stayed inside, then they would die. Even Adam and the others were shocked by Lyle's words. The coldness in his voice was completely different compared to his previous demeanor. Lyle picked up Adam before going between some shacks. He couldn't be certain that nobody would try and peek at what was happening, and if that happened, he would need to kill that person and perhaps all the others since they could potentially leak his secret. Lyle put Adam down and leaned him up against a shack before taking out his dagger and cutting his palm. He then stared at Adam as his hair suddenly started dancing around in the air. His previously black eyes turned red and two large fangs grew out from his mouth. Adam was scared senseless by the sight and opened his mouth to scream, only for Lyle's hand to grab it and force him to drink down his blood while Lyle bit his neck. The exchange of blood continued for about 10 seconds before Adam closed his eyes. His body turned cold as his blood stopped flowing for a short period of time. Suddenly Lyle could hear Adam's heartbeat as the latter opened his eyes and took a long breath. His chest rose up in the air as the sound of bones breaking could be heard. Adam's body was now going through a change. He was becoming a vampire, which meant that his entire body would change from the inside out. His teeth fell before being replaced by new ones. His skin started peeling off as a new layer quickly grew out. His bones broke before mending themselves and growing stronger while his veins ruptured. His screams echoed inside the cave as Lyle moved a bit and stared at the entrance of the cave. Adam would need some time to complete his transformation and Lyle wasn't going to let anyone see him just yet.